Let's get right into it. The first thing I have for you in what does a dissertation chair look for in Chapter 5 are some items related to the table of contents. You may think, well, this is kind of strange, Dr. Rich. Why are you talking about the table of contents in Lesson 5? Because when I see the dissertation put together, I'll look at the table of contents first. And in regards to Chapter 5, these are the things I look for. I look to see how many pages are in Chapter 5. If there's only 10 pages, chances are there's not much good information in there. It's probably just a little too thin, if you will. It's probably going to need a lot more pages than that. Consequently, if it has 40 pages in there, either there are a lot of research questions or somebody just writes a little too much. But there has to be a balance, and I don't have an exact number for you, but I do know that 10 is too few and 40 is too many. A lot of it's going to depend on how many research questions there are and how many themes perhaps were produced in a qualitative study. If you have 3 research questions in a quantitative study, by the time you put information about each of the independent variables and then you write whether or not the null hypothesis rejected or failed to be rejected and what that means, that may mean that each one of those research questions that you wrote about is about 2 pages long, maybe a page and a half for each one of them. But if you're like one of my mentees who had 11 quantitative research questions, well, that chapter is a little bit longer. Same as if you produce, 18 different themes out of your qualitative research as compared to somebody who produces 8 themes. Of course, the chapter is going to be a little bit different in length depending on what you have in there. But I have a pretty good feeling by looking at how many research questions and what's in the chapter as far as pages and whether there's a good balance. That just came to me from years of experience. How many headings? Are there like 3 headings? That's a, introduction, findings, and conclusion. Now, more than likely, there's a few more headings than that. But oftentimes I see, just merely the introduction. I see the implications. I see the conclusions and findings, and that's it. And I think that's sad because, as you know so far, by going through all the lessons I've provided in this lesson plan for Chapter 5, you should have more headings than that. If not, then perhaps there's an opportunity to improve your work to make sure that there's more headings. You may want to consider every heading that I addressed in this lesson plan to be in your dissertation so you can bring great credit and quality upon yourself, your committee members, and the university. What are the headings? If there's 5 different headings, what are they? Sometimes I see students put in their own headings, and I don't think that's a good idea. Remember, your faculty members are trained and were conditioned for certain headings. Same as your university has an expectation. If they gave you a template and it has 7 headings in there, and you turn in your dissertation and it has 12 headings in there, that may not be a good thing. Same as if you look at the headings that are in there, are they inclusive of the information that should be in a research report? I mean, if there's nothing that talks about the body of knowledge on how that gap was closed, then perhaps something's missing there. So it's not just a matter about how many pages or how many headings, it's also about what are the headings, because this gets us into the quality part of the work. And then I also like to look at the balance of the chapter. If you have 3 independent quantitative variables, then I'm looking for somewhat of a balance when you write those. So if you have research question number 1 and that's maybe 2 pages long, and then research question number 2 is about a quarter of a page long or 2 paragraphs, and then the third question is more like 4 pages, well, you can see the balance is not there. I also look for qualitative work to see how the themes are written and how many pages they have. I expect a balance, and what I mean by a balance is that I expect more content for the first couple themes than the last couple themes that you write about. I mean, after all, the most common themes that you're going to write about first. So if you interviewed 18 people and 16 people agreed and produced a certain theme, there must be more content than the themes that only had maybe 6 or 8 people agree to them. So more than likely, the more people that are involved in the theme creation, the theme should have more content. And so therefore, if the first theme that is written about out of, let's just say, 6 themes is the least amount of content, and the middle ones have more content, it just doesn't look balanced, I'll be able to see very quickly, and then it'll help me to go into the chapter. Now, I can tell you from personal experience, and speaking with many of my peers over the years, as we start to look at a dissertation, whether it be even a proposal or whether it be a certain heading, When we start to find problems, we start to look deeper. That means if you have a fair amount of pages, the headings are the right ones, and you have a balance of your chapter, I as a dissertation chair or a review of your work I am not going to go into it and look as deep for more problems than I might otherwise. But if I don't see there's a balance or that the right headings are there, then it's going to cause me to roll up my sleeves a little bit more, tune in, and just really go more in detail in your work. And sometimes that's good, but sometimes that means, if I find one problem, I'm probably going to find two or three more problems, and I'm probably going to find 4 or 5 more problems. So I hope that gives you some information just about the table of contents. Then I'm going to look at that balanced introduction section. As I talked about in the introduction lesson, I indicated that the introduction section should be about 3 or 4 paragraphs long. Again, if there's only one paragraph or there's 8 paragraphs, I might get a little curious and wonder why there is so much or too little. I'm going to look for the summary of the study. Did you give an adequate summary? Now, perhaps your introduction section is longer because you include the summary in there, and that's fine. But I should be able to find somewhat of an introduction and summary and something that tells me what follows in the chapter between the introduction and the summary section. As you're going through your work, make sure you put in the salient points like I talked about in that lesson about the summary. Make sure the reader understands basically what your purpose of your study was about, what the research question about, what the answers were to those research questions, what the significant value of that research is to the stakeholders. Next thing, of course, is to look at the interpretations of the data. For the research questions, did you give all the information that answers each research question? And then once you answered each research question, what did that mean? What was the meaning? So interpretations of the data. If you have 8 themes, did you provide all 8 themes? Sometimes I've read where 8 themes were produced in chapter 4, but then there's only 6 themes written about in chapter 5. Now you can see something's wrong with that, right? And you'd be surprised at just the mistakes that people make, not meaningly. It just happens because people get busy, they get caught up in what they're doing, and sometimes these small mistakes are made. And that's why you have dissertation chair and committee members to help you. Of course, then there's that context of the study. Did you put your work within the body of knowledge context? Because after all, you're part of an academic community. What you're producing is an academic outcome. This academic assignment of your dissertation should somehow be placed within the context of the body of knowledge, whether you're extending the body of knowledge, whether you're closing a gap in the literature, but somehow this needs to be included in Chapter 5. And as I talked about in the lesson on the context of the study in this Chapter 5 series, that this is one area in many dissertations is not there. And oftentimes this will be why, or at least one of the reasons why a study is not approved at the university level. The reason I also have a separate lesson about what does the university people look at a study, because oftentimes their perspective is different than a dissertation chair. And that's okay because a dissertation chair has their view and how we're supposed to help you. The value of this program is at least I have had time as an administrator and I know what they're looking for as well within a certain amount of knowledge that I have based on the work that I did. Then there's the implications of the study. How many implications are there? So as a dissertation chair, I'd like to think that there's a couple implications to at least the stakeholders that involved, those people who are involved as your survey population, maybe perhaps others related to them. So if you happen to have been studying nurses, well, maybe there's an implication to the nursing leadership in the hospitals. Perhaps there's an implication to the patients. If you're a school teacher and you did some sort of survey or interviews of grade school teachers, well, there should be some implications for those teachers, but maybe also the district leaders, maybe even the parents. And of course, there should be some sort of implication to the university's mission that you're enrolled in. So if you happen to be at Walden University, like where I earned my PhD, I would expect to see some sort of implications to social impact because that's part of the mission of the university. No matter what university you're at, there's part of the mission that needs to be included. I look for recommendations. I also look for recommendations to almost align with the conclusions and implications in the same sense that there should be some sort of recommendation that goes out to the people who are suffering the problem the most, the survey population, on why you did your study. There should be some recommendation. There should be some recommendation for leaders to make a better choice, or for the users to be able to do something different based on the meaning that you produced by answering your research questions. How many recommendations should there be? How many implications should there be? This is going to be up to you, and it's going to be determined on an individual basis. But oftentimes what I find is that students, when they're writing these sections, take a shallow view, and they just talk about or write about the few recommendations instead of the few others they could to strengthen the value of their work overall. What are the contributions of the study? You need to contribute something. After all, you're creating new knowledge. You have new meaning that you've produced. When you were examining something through your research study, the idea was that something wasn't known. That's why you did the research, to provide meaning, to provide information. So therefore, you have to have a contribution of the study. And I would encourage you to have one or two, if not three contributions at a minimum in your chapter, much like I alluded to on the lesson about contributions of the study. Always you should have something that reflects the future direction of the body of knowledge. Now, as you're hearing from me in this lesson strategy, much of what a dissertation chair looks for are the headings that I've already described to you. So in essence, I'm hoping that this reinforcement helps you to make sure when you're writing your Chapter 5 or you're evaluating your Chapter 5 to say, where else can you add value? How can you help the reader of your work 2 years from now, 5 years from now, get a benefit from your research study that you've done? That balanced conclusion or summary section, as I've indicated in that lesson strategy about the conclusion, is think about if somebody only read the conclusion or summary of your chapter, that very last section in Chapter 5, would it be enticing enough? Would it be filled with enough enthusiasm and passion to make the reader feel or believe that they want to go back and read more of your dissertation? That your conclusion ended on a high note and it closed the loop. It helped somebody to learn what was the one thing that your study found that was not expected, that finding that's critical. Now I'm going to share a couple other overall perspectives that a dissertation chair looks for in Chapter 5. Of course, one of the most important things, as I've been emphasizing throughout this and many of the other lessons throughout this program about taking the BI of ABD, is higher order critical thinking. Higher order critical thinking is reflective of taking the data that you had in Chapter 4 and synthesizing it all, putting it into some sort of analysis or evaluating that data to produce that meaning. If all you did was indicate, in Chapter 4 there was data that suggested something, that's not enough. You have to give the information on why, specifically what data in Chapter 4. Help the reader understand that you are an academic, that you are earning the highest degree, and therefore you're writing like a person who has earned their doctorate degree. In Chapter 5, I look for these tiebacks to Chapter 4. Remember, as I talked about recommendations and conclusions, make sure each one of them is tied back to where it was born from in the data in Chapter 4. If you just say the findings of this study suggest X, Y, and Z, that's not enough. What findings? What was it in Chapter 4? Was it the testing of a null hypothesis? Was it the creation of a theme because 10 out of 14 people indicated something of importance? When you can tie it back and you can justify it and give the rationale, that's powerful. And that's what you want in your Chapter 5. Powerful tie-ins. That overall perspective of closing the loop of the entire study. The prior item I mentioned was tiebacks to Chapter 4. But now let's talk about that closing the loop. Let's look at how you close the loop and how your data produced information that you then created meaning from. And that meaning was then what was used to answer the research questions. That meaning helped to fill in the void of that gap in the body of knowledge. That information goes to stakeholders to use to lessen the problem that you wrote about in Chapter 1. Very easily, in that few sentences, I closed the loop to every other chapter in your dissertation. Now you need to make sure you do the same in the overall perspective of your chapter. When somebody's done reading your work, can they basically put it down and say, oh, I see how that whole thing was put together. like a good movie or a good book, novel that you read, and when you finish it, somebody says, "Wow, that was good," and then you start talking about it with your friends? Or will somebody say, I just didn't understand what happened in that dissertation. It seemed disconnected. And oftentimes, the early drafts of a dissertation, and sometimes it gets to the university level for reviews and it gets denied. It's because it wasn't tied together well enough. Sometimes the student and the committee members doing the very best they can miss certain things. And that's why your university has a third party reviewer, somebody who hasn't been working in it for so long, because sometimes you just can't see the areas for improvement for like yourself who has been living in this document probably for 2 years, and your committee members who have seen different drafts of it along the way, and it's sometimes hard to see the bigger picture when you're looking at the individual areas for improvement. That content flow, as I mentioned, does the information flow well? Does it go from the beginning of the chapter with an introduction? Does it tie back to the chapter 4? Does it flow throughout the chapter in a positive way that somebody can rein in on your work and say, wow, that writer was passionate about what they did. They produced a great study. There's a certain flow that goes with your work. And even looking at the table of contents, sometimes you can see that flow. I look for action words. When you start to indicate the value of your work and how significant your work could be, don't be bashful about indicating how your work has the potential to be substantial to whoever the stakeholders are, that if by chance they incorporate some of your findings into what they're doing, that it could lessen the problem, and therefore maybe they could be more efficient, more effective, save money, train students better, save patients more. Whatever it is, be actionable in your words in chapter 5. And that's what I mean about being passionate. Let somebody really gain the insights from you based on your work and the passion you have that allowed you to get to this point in writing your chapter 5. The academic rigor. Make sure you use the right word choices. Make sure that all your work is aligned to the research context. Use the words that are related to the industry that you're in, but also to the academic level that you're writing at the doctorate level. Format alignment. Make sure your format is done. One of the things I find the most irritating is that when I see a dissertation draft from a student at any level, that their figures are still wrong, the captions are not correct, that there's still spacing errors in formats of quoting in the in-text citations, or that there's spacing in between paragraphs that's wrong. Oftentimes what I'll do, and I encourage you to do the same exact thing that I'm going to say right now, when you get your chapter 5 done, in your Word document, reduce the size of the word choices so you can see the whole document. Instead of 100% or 120% where you're just looking at one page, reduce it down to maybe 20 or 30%. And what you'll get is you'll be able to see 5, 6, 7, 8 pages at the same time on your screen of your computer or your monitor if you have a monitor. And you can look at the format. I do this all the time. I'll take a look at that and say, are the headings done right? Are they consistent? Are the spacing for indentions done correctly? I can literally tell, because I've been doing this for 20 years, that the format is either good or not so good. And because I've been doing this for so long, you may not be able to do this quite yet, but I'm sure if you teach and you grade enough papers in 20 years, some things are just going to stick out. Just like in your profession, you would see things that nobody else sees because of all your years of experience. But take a look at the format. It needs to be aligned. If you can't do this, I encourage you then to consider an APA editor. If you can't afford one, then see if you can barter with somebody to be able to proofread your work. Or maybe you have an adult child, perhaps, who is maybe even out in college, or maybe you have a child that's in high school. Sometimes you can have somebody else who's close to you read your work, and they can find mistakes that you can't because they haven't been working in the same document for so long. But you have to have this format alignment. And it's that overall physical view. The paragraphs, 3 to 7 sentences long. Are there paragraphs that are not, 3 or 4 of them very short with 3 sentences and 3 or 4 of them with, 7 sentences? Does the physical view invite people? Oftentimes, if I see one page, that's one full paragraph, I'm like, oh, I got to read this whole thing? Because it doesn't flow well. It's the format and the alignment. It's just perhaps not as good as it could be otherwise. And it's just like a book. If you open up a good book, a novel, you'll see the way they do paragraphs. You'll see that the paragraphs are not, 8 or 7 sentences long, every one of them. There'll be a content flow. There'll be this physical view that you can look at and say, wow, this is well put together. This is the same thing you have to look at your work. Now, you may not think that a chair looks for these kind of things, but I would indicate to you now, these are some of the things that we look for. We may not look for them early on in the chapter development, but as the chapter gets developed and it starts to come to where it's going to be ready for others to review, then we start looking at these kinds of areas, because the other smaller, more important areas of the content development is there. And now it's about fine-tuning your work to be as good as it can be, so that when it goes to your other committee members or goes to the university, that your reputation, as well as the chair's reputation and the committee member's reputation, is protected. And I have one last thing. So far I've given you 21 tips. Can you imagine that? I gave you 21 tips already. Were you counting them? Wow, 21 tips. But I've got to give you this last tip. And from a dissertation chair perspective, this is something that you should know. And if you don't know this, it's something, worthy, because the idea of your dissertation has to be something worthy of our reputation. As a dissertation chair, when I sign a dissertation, or as a committee member, when I sign a dissertation, what I am doing is I'm indicating that this work is a true representation of the quality that I can produce, that I can mentor, that I can chair. My reputation is tied to every one of my mentees' dissertations. You have to keep in mind that while you are doing the work and your committee is guiding you, they still have to protect their own reputation. And I'll tell you, quite honestly, some dissertation chairs give their signatures more freely than others. There's nothing wrong with that. Everybody has their own perceptions and their own values on what the work is that they're going to sign. But I can tell you, the majority of dissertation chairs that I know and committee members will not sign something that's not well developed and presented. Nobody wants to send your work to the university and get denied. Because I can tell you, some dissertation chairs, with their dissertations get denied over and over and over, they don't stay a dissertation chair very long, and rightfully so, because their job is to protect for the university. So you can feel pretty confident that if a dissertation chair signs your dissertation as approved, and committee members do the same, that your work has met a certain level of quality, academic rigor, it's presented well, and it's going to bring great credit upon you, those committee members, and of course the university. If you don't have a sense for this, you might want to talk with your dissertation chair and say, what are your expectations of the final draft? You might have that conversation as you're writing the final effort or the final draft of your Chapter 5, because the sooner you know this and you know what those expectations are, then it's easier for you to meet those expectations and exceed them. A lot of times some of my mentees will say, well, Dr. Rich, what do you really want at the end result? And I'll say, have you looked at any other dissertations that I've mentored? Have you read them? Take a look at some of the others that I have done and worked with, and that's pretty much what I'm looking for. But I'm also willing to share any other insights in the dialogue. As a reflective summary, I've given you 22 different things that dissertation chairs look for in Chapter 5. I hope you've taken some good notes. Use those notes as perhaps a checklist to make sure your work is well developed in its design and is presented in a manner that brings out your passion, brings out the excitement that you have of your work, that shows your area of expertise. Because when you do your dissertation, one looks at you as an expert. You've just done all the review of the literature. You've done the research. You know what you've done to contribute to the body of knowledge and how your data produced information to give meaning to other people to make better decisions. Make sure that clearly comes out in your Chapter 5, and you'll get your Chapter 5 approved, and you'll graduate. Look at your Chapter 5 as a complete standalone document that represents your entire study. Once you've drafted Chapter 5, I encourage you to kind of step back a little bit and ensure that all the areas I've addressed so far in this lesson plan are areas that are reflective in your work, and they're done well, so that your entire dissertation can be reflected in Chapter 5. And at the end of it, you may even try giving your Chapter 5 to somebody to read, somebody perhaps a peer student who has some basic understanding of what dissertations are, or perhaps if you're a faculty member, one of your peer faculty, and just ask them to read Chapter 5 and ask them several questions. Does it solicit from them or elicit from them to be able to want to read more? Do they see the document as a full document? Did it flow well? Was it understandable? Was the language appropriate? These kinds of questions about your work can help you to refine your work even more. I wish you great success at designing your Chapter 5. I have one more lesson in this lesson strategy for Chapter 5. Watch it whenever you're ready. Thank you very much,